Hello, everyone. We're going to get started. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Emerson Brooking, Resident Fellow at the Digital Forensic Research Lab of the Atlantic Council. I'm honored to be moderating this event on the Iranian domestic information environment, co-hosted by the Digital Forensic Research Lab and the Rafiq Hariri Center at the Atlantic Council. I'd like to start by acknowledging the passing of Hisham al-Hashimi, a counterterrorism expert known to many on this call. He was assassinated in Baghdad on Monday following threats from Kataib Hezbollah. He died too soon. These are extraordinary times for the study of information in Iran. As the country was hit early and hard by the COVID-19 pandemic, Iranian authorities responded with censorship and half-truths. The result has been widespread health misinformation and conspiratorialism. At the same time, Iran remains locked in an information battle with the United States and regional adversaries. The U.S. assassination of Qasem Soleimani and shoot-down of Ukrainian Airlines Flight 752 have been redefined by Iranian propagandists. More recently, there's been a fierce media battle over the nature of explosions at Natanz nuclear site and other strategic locations. All the while, Iran's international broadcasting efforts continue in earnest. These include not just television and radio, but also networks of Twitter and Facebook sock puppets. One recent target has been the George Floyd protests in the United States. This is complex terrain, and we're lucky to have a distinguished panel of experts to help us navigate it. Joining us are Fahad Suzanchi, Director of FactName, who leads a fact-checking initiative focused on domestic Iran. Michael Lippin, a reporter with the Voice of America, who's extensively covered both Iran and digital activism. Samin Kargar, a non-resident fellow at the Digital Forensic Research Lab and a doctoral student at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced and International Studies, focused on influence operations in the Middle East. And finally, Holly Digris, a non-resident fellow with the Atlantic Council's Middle East program, editor of the Atlantic Council's Iran Source blog, and a curator of the Iranist newsletter. We'll begin with opening statements, move to moderated discussions, and then open the floor to questions. You can submit your questions by using the Q&A function of the Zoom client. We intend to end exactly on the hour. And with that, Farhad, I'll turn first to you and would welcome your discussion of what it is like to fact check in Iran now amid the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you very much, Emerson. Hello, everyone. My name is Farhad Suzanchi. I'm the editor of FactName.com, which is based out of Toronto, is Iran's first political fact-checking website, launched in 2013 during the presidential elections. We fact-check claims made by Iranian politicians and public figures. And I would like to talk a bit about our activities during the COVID-19 pandemics and dealing with misinformation around it. The first case of COVID-19 in Iran was reported on February 19. There were speculations from weeks earlier around the spread of the virus, but the government actively denied it, apparently to prevent any impact on the turnout for the elections, which were going to be held on February 21, and the rallies of the anniversary of the revolution on February 11. From the very early days, just like the other parts of the world, we were faced with a wave of false content and rumors. This included a range of misinformation, some of them harmless, like The Simpsons predicting all this years ago, to more serious ones with incorrect information about how to prevent contracting the virus and fake remedies. We tackled these by publishing fact sheets and fact check articles covering what was known about the virus, its origin, symptoms. A lot of the online misinformation we encountered were recycled and translated from other countries. And the fact that we were in touch with other fact checkers around the world through international fact checking network helped us a lot in faster response. And government statements range from misleading statements comparing death rates from the flu between Iran and the US, and the outrageous allegations that the Baha'is were hoarding essential equipment to combat the pandemic. But probably the most repeated misinformation was the claim that the coronavirus is a biological weapon made by the US government. Some in the US might have heard the same claim, except that it was made by China. A 3-hour panel on state television with a few known conspiracy theories, including Philip Giraldi, who is a well-known American conspiracy theorist, was broadcast on television discussing the idea that COVID-19 is a biological weapon designed to target the Iranian genome. This claim later was repeated several times by none other than Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, and other officials. Even the day after the parliamentary elections, he called the outbreak a conspiracy by the enemies to hinder voter turnout. Khamenei, he began repeating this claim more frequently in his speeches, and even he included it in his Nowruz address, the warning that foreign enemies might enter in Iran disguised as medical personnel to assess the effectiveness of their weapons. Sure enough, after that, Iran expelled a team of Doctors Without Borders who had recently arrived. Of course, heads of state spreading false information or outright conspiracy theories is not unique to Iran. I mean, we're seeing it in US and Brazil, for example. However, there's a big difference. And in the case of Iran, this happens under completely different circumstances. In Iran, the supreme leader's claims cannot be publicly criticized, and his statements are viewed sort of as the de facto government positions, which lends legitimacy to conspiracy theorists and move public opinion towards public belief. An example of this would be that during those days, Iran's Ministry of Foreign Affairs even tweeted out an article about this so-called US biological warfare from an infamous global research website, which is a well-known conspiracy theory platform. We published 7 fact checks in total about this issue only. But unfortunately, soon after that, Khamenei stopped repeating this claim, which was very encouraging for us. In general, this politicizing a health crisis and the urge for the authorities to save face only contributed to more problems. One example was an embarrassing incident where the head of the Revolutionary Guard appeared on national television to publicly unveil a comically fake handheld device that claimed it can detect a contaminated person or area within a radius of 100 meters using magnetic system of resonance. This time even domestic voices were raised, and Iran's physics society called it imaginary science. This lack of trust in public officials also gave rise to a wide range of charlatans and fake scientists to make false claims about discovering a variety of cures, from a made-up remedy that involves copper wire and salted water, all the way to camel urine. And unfortunately, many people fall for these tricks out of desperation. I was personally talking to some of them on some messaging apps, and they were really frustrated and said, we don't know who to believe. What should we do? Just wait to get the virus and die? And this desperation, I think, is very concerning. People with bad information and people who don't have the necessary tools to find good and factual information can make bad decisions and will make bad decisions that can harm them, their family, and others. So as fact checkers, we're trying to go beyond this just publishing articles. We need to arm people with the necessary tools and knowledge to detect this unreliable information. And we also have come to the conclusion that we need to go beyond written articles and experiment with videos, podcasts, to reach more people. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer more questions.
All right, thank you very much.
No
and
problem.
I'll turn next to Michael and ask, how is so Michael, you face the task of reporting from the outside on Iran in trying to sort through the different content that you receive, trying to figure out what is accurate and what's not, and then also trying to cultivate sources within Iran. So if you could talk a bit about that process and how you bring some transparency from the outside to a governmental system that's so closed.
Well, thank you, Emerson. I'll be happy to talk about that. Thank you also to the DFR Lab team and the Atlantic Council for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. Well, let me just start by giving you a bit of background on what I do at VOA. I am a bridge editor for the VOA Persian division, and my role is to collaborate with the English News Center of VOA and also the other foreign language services of VOA to produce original stories for our English website, voanews.com, using the best original content produced by the Persian service. And that content includes interviews that we do with people inside Iran speaking in Farsi. It includes interviews that we do with policymakers and analysts in the US and elsewhere speaking in English, and also user-generated content from our audience members inside Iran. Now, getting to what Emerson was talking about, I'd like to discuss today VOA Persian's two main sources of non-governmental information from inside Iran about how the pandemic has been affecting daily life, about how Iran has kept many dissidents jailed despite the coronavirus spreading within prisons, and about how Iran has even refused to let those activists get outside medical treatment. So the first main source of non-governmental information has been the interviews that we've done with activists inside Iran and with Iran-based relatives of other activists who are imprisoned and who cannot speak for themselves. The second main source is user-generated content, or UGC, that consists mainly of images like photos and video clips from Iranians showing us how the pandemic has affected their daily lives in different parts of the country. So let me start by telling you what I've found to be interesting about the interviews that VOA has done. What has been striking for me is the number of Iranians who have told us that we can publish their full names despite Iran's hostility toward VOA. You know, Iran doesn't allow us to work there. So obviously there is a risk of Iran retaliating against people who speak to us. Despite that, VOA Persian has been able to interview 22 Iran-based activists and relatives of detained activists since mid-February, and that's when, of course, Iran reported its first coronavirus cases. 16 of the Iran-based interviewees that we spoke to were confident enough for us to use their full names, while 6 other Iran-based interviewees were speaking to us on condition of background, meaning that we had to describe their identities in general terms, and several more interviewees were based outside of Iran, and obviously they were more comfortable with speaking to VOA for that reason. So why have most of our interviewees been willing to have their names published? What my colleagues and I have learned is that they do so for 2 main reasons. One is that some believe the Iranian government can't do much to hurt them because they are retired and no longer rely on the government or government-backed businesses for work. And others believe that gaining international attention for their cause, for example, raising awareness about the plight of a loved one who's in jail, will be better for them in the long run than staying silent. Now, have those people been vindicated in their beliefs? What I can say is that we have not been notified of Iranian authorities harassing any of the interviewees that we've named in the past few months. But of course, some harassment could have happened without us being made aware of it. What about the sources inside Iran who asked for their names not to be used? Now, they tend to have 2 reasons for requesting anonymity. Either they're afraid of Iranian authorities retaliating against them personally for speaking to VOA, or they fear retaliation against their family members. One important piece of context regarding VOA's ability to interview people inside Iran is that most people whom we've contacted there have actually declined to speak with us at all about pandemic-related social issues or about legal cases involving jailed activists. And the reasons for those declined interview requests are the same as I just mentioned: fear of retaliation from the Iranian government. Now, moving on to our second main source of pandemic-related information from inside Iran, and that is user-generated content, or UGC. In February and March, VOA Persian received images and other material about the pandemic from our Iran-based audience members via our social media channels. Prior to that, VOA had put together a team of journalists, including myself, from several VOA departments, each of us with our own Iran expertise, and we were assigned to vet this content. We used a variety of techniques to do so to ensure the credibility of the content, while also acknowledging in our published reports that we could not independently verify that content by being on the ground in Iran to see for ourselves what was going on there. So I'd like to share with you what some of these vetting processes have involved. When it came to verifying the location of a clip that was said to be from Tehran, we assigned one member of our team who had previously worked as a journalist in the Iranian capital to vet that clip based on his personal knowledge of the area. As for video clips said to be from other parts of Iran that our team may not have personally visited, we looked at the key features of the scenery from those clips, and we found them to be similar or identical to verified online images from those locations. Now, in terms of a video clip of an Iranian sharing and narrating his or her observations about the pandemic, we searched social media for other video clips said to be posted in the same time frame, with narrators making similar observations about the same locations as the clip that we were trying to vet. For example, we used this method to vet clips of Iranians who were expressing frustrations about obtaining personal protective equipment, or PPE, and there were shortages of PPE for many Iranian consumers back in February and March. The last vetting method that I wanted to share with you is the use of our contacts within our own social networks to ensure the credibility of images that we receive. Now, for one story that we produced about Pakistanis who were stranded inside Iran by the outbreak and who were trying to get transportation back to their home country, a journalist with a VOA's DWAS service for Pakistan obtained a video clip from a Facebook friend of his who was inside Iran, and that clip showed the journalist's Pakistani friend taking a bus with other Pakistanis toward the Iranian border with Pakistan. So we knew that the clip came from a credible source who was known to one of our journalists. And I'd like to wrap up with that. I'll be happy to answer questions from our audience about these methods that VOA has been using to get information from inside Iran about the pandemic, as well as questions on any other topics that I can address. Emerson?
Thank you, Michael. Now, this domestic information competition does not take place in a vacuum. So over to Samin. If you could talk a bit more about the regional competition and how these narratives develop.
Sure. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much to the Atlantic Council for having us here today. As Farhad and Michael described, the domestic information landscape was already pretty convoluted and confusing. But there's also a regional and international layer to how the pandemic and other political events have played out in the recent months. So in the face of the pandemic, Iran became the subject of harsh criticisms regionally, mostly led by Saudi state media and also a couple Twitter campaigns. Accusing Iran of handling the outbreak poorly, kind of highlighting the relationship between Iran and proxy groups across the region, including in Yemen, Syria, and Lebanon, and how that kind of facilitates the spread of the virus throughout the Middle East, and why Iran should be blamed even further for the outbreak. This on itself led to demonizing the Shiite population in the predominantly Sunni countries such as Saudi and Bahrain. This reflected pretty well on how the state media in these countries packaged the news about the corona outbreak, both in Iran and across the region. And also on Twitter, we saw both Saudi-led and in some cases Egyptian-led Twitter campaigns using hashtags such as Iran exports coronavirus to the region and so on, basically to amplify and demonize Iran further and to kind of divert attention from those states' responsibility to deal with the situation in their respective countries and to kind of reflect blame on their regional rivals. Now, on the other hand, Saudi especially did a pretty good job of praising themselves in terms of how they handled the pandemic and kind of placing themselves as a role model for other countries in the region. Internationally, in April, Facebook took down a batch of Iranian assets from their network. I think there were about 120 pages, 390 Facebook accounts, 27 groups, and a few Instagram accounts. Facebook attributed these networks to a pretty prolific and persistent network that had already been detected back in 2018. It's called the International Union of Virtual Media, abbreviated as IUVM. And as I said, they have been pretty active throughout the past few years, despite being repeatedly taken down by Facebook and Twitter. What we see on the international level, however, is interesting because it kind of highlights how the international and foreign influence operations that Iran conducts basically recycles and repurposes the Iranian state media talking points, as well as the authorities as high-ranking as the supreme leader himself, to underscore Iran's foreign policy priorities both in the region and across the world. For example, this network, one of their priorities, at least in April and the prior months, which was basically the beginning of the corona outbreak, was to highlight anti-US sentiments and topics, and at the same time praise China. As Farhad mentioned, the conspiracy theories about the pandemic being a biological attack designed and implemented by the United States on both China and Iran and other bad actors that the US doesn't get along with, was already going around in Iran. So what IUVM did was to take that, amplify it, and basically cater it to an international audience. And so to me, that's one more reason why we need to keep an eye on domestic operations, because those are the boiling grounds for what we might see later on the international level. I think I'm going to pause there and we can talk more on during the Q&A.
Samin, thanks very much. And now over to Holly, because everything that's happening regionally is also happening internationally. You could talk about Iranian international broadcasting amid a very restive global period.
Well, I was actually hoping to maybe focus a little more specifically on the Black Lives Matter protests because those are very recent, and it's been really interesting to see how Iran has responded to the Black Lives Matter protests. And with that in mind, I think it's also important to look at the context of the past 8 months, which were marred by a series of national crises within Iran. And I'd like to start by talking about those crises themselves. In November 2019, we had nationwide protests in Iran that resulted with the deaths of between 300 to 1,500 protesters. In January, we had the accidental shooting down of a Ukraine International Airlines flight that killed 176 on board. And of course, if it wasn't for international pressure from countries like Canada, we probably wouldn't have ever found that Iran admitting to what had happened, and they would have blamed it on a mechanical failure. And then in February, we had the parliamentary elections on February 21st. And despite it being a low turnout, it actually played a large role in the spread of the coronavirus because just days before that, as Farhad had mentioned, there were some cases on the ground. So with these mounting crises in Iran, what essentially was a very big problem for the Islamic Republic, to an extent, got sidetracked briefly because of the Black Lives Matter protests that were kicked off after George Floyd was killed in Minnesota. And essentially, this became a propaganda gift to the Islamic Republic, who had for months been at the center of the Trump administration's attention, whether that be through tweets we've been seeing on social media or actual statements from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo or Special Envoy Brian Hook. And so we saw Iranian officials publicize their schadenfreude by tweeting solidarity statements, and even state media outlets devoting wide coverage to Black Lives Matter protest coverage. So, for example, DFR Lab actually pointed out that George Floyd's name was repeated 4,600 times in Persian language articles, and Graphica, which uses AI to analyze huge volumes of social media traffic, said that they couldn't find evidence of a covert interference campaign, but we still also saw online the use of a hashtag Iran with George Floyd. We also saw a lot of Iranian officials weighing in on the protests. We saw Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei using the hashtag I can't breathe. We also saw Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif troll the Trump administration. He used a screenshot of a State Department statement in relationship to the December 2017, January 2018 Iran protests, and instead of it's talking about Iran and condemning the actions of the Iranian government and its use of force against protesters, he switched it around so it would say the United States. So the Iranian officials saw the protests as an opportunity to call out what they perceive as hypocrisy of the U.S.'s stance on human rights in the light of its handling of the Black Lives Matter protesters. But when you look a little more closely, you actually will see that most of their tweets were actually about U.S. sanctions reimposed by the Trump administration as part of their maximum pressure campaign. I think what was very noteworthy was that there was even a candlelight vigil for George Floyd in the city of Mashhad. And that was very ironic because Iranians themselves were not allowed to honor those that were killed in the November 2019 protests or in the plane crash. And peaceful protesters were arrested for demanding justice for the victims. But while the Iranian government spent a lot of time putting out this information online, there was an online backlash as well. We found that Iranians inside and outside of Iran were quick to call out the hypocrisy of these Iranian officials on social media, given their own record of suppressing and killing protesters. Former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad had actually quoted rapper Tupac Shakur on Twitter, and users actually reminded him that he actually played a big role in the brutal repression of 2009's Green Movement uprising. So We also, just to cut things a little short, we also saw backlash from Iranian politicians. We saw a former member of parliament condemn the killing of George Floyd while also addressing problems at home. We also saw Faizeh Hashemi Rafsanjani, the activist and daughter of President Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, point out the Iranian government's hypocrisy of free speech and treatment of religious and ethnic minorities. So I think overall, to conclude, anytime there's protests in the United States, whether it be Black Lives Matter this year or in Ferguson during 2014 or the Occupy Wall Street protests in 2011, you can count on Iran to exploit them and to use them to hide their own human rights violations.
Well, Holly, thank you very much. And a reminder to the audience that if you have any questions you want answered, simply use the Q&A function on Zoom. We will turn shortly to audience questions, but I have one question for the group that intersects, I think, many of the themes that have been touched on here. And that's going back to the recent explosion at Natanz nuclear facility and the, I believe, 5 mysterious explosions that have occurred across Tehran in the last 2 weeks. I know there's been quite a bit of domestic misinformation here. There have been particular messages shared by the Iranian authorities, and international journalists received a press release from a group calling themselves the Cheetahs of the Homeland, who claimed responsibility for the attack or for the incident at Natanz. And I'll say, I myself, this misinformation hasn't been confined to a small community. For English-speaking security people, there was a very viral video purported to show an explosion in Tehran, which was actually an oil explosion in Philadelphia, which a number of us shared before realizing our error. So I'd welcome your thoughts on this from both domestic, regional, and international perspectives.
I'll piggyback on that. So I think for one of the big problems right now, as we've all highlighted, is this use of social media and the way that messaging is being put out, whether it be by the Iranian government or people online that could be opposed to the government. And so one of the problems with what happened this past week is that there's this fog of war, essentially, where we're all trying to rush to understand what's going on. There are Iranians posting things online, and we're trying to confirm and verify what's happening on the ground. But then at the same time, there are also people that have invested interest to maybe provoke a bigger story, make something bigger than what it is, or put out something so that they can actually get their own likes and retweets, as we saw with that one viral video that was of Philadelphia. So it's one of those things where we're all trying to rush to find the information, and we're in a time of Twitter, when we're all looking for instant gratification or instant information. We're kind of putting fact checking in the background sometimes, and I think it's an example of why we should tread slowly and actually look and research and check with people on the ground before rushing to conclusions.
Well, I can definitely back up what Holly was saying on that front. I also did some coverage of the fire and explosion at the Natanz nuclear site last week, and I had seen, as I was researching my article, anonymously made comments in several other publications, speculating about who might have been responsible for an attack on that site. But what I try to do for my own VOA reporting is just go with sources that can be attributed in an article. And I interviewed a researcher at the Institute for Science and International Security, and the lady I spoke to was able to share, on the record with me, her research that showed that the damage to this facility was quite extensive. It suggested that it was not an accident, although I was careful in my story to say that she had mentioned there was no certainty about any device that may have caused an explosion. So I just generally try to avoid amplifying anonymous sources in other articles. I try to go with facts that I can get from people whom I can actually name in my stories.
I'm also going to share two observations. One, on the domestic level, obviously the Iranian regime has its network of amplifiers of propaganda and the talking points of the regime. What was interesting to me in this case is that those accounts have been surprisingly relatively quiet in this case. It's as though they have not been given much to talk about or promote or spin the narrative. And that's either because there's still confusion within the establishment about how to proceed to kind of like do a damage control in terms of messaging and what sort of narrative they put out there, or it could be that they have been specifically instructed not to spin it too much to avoid further confusion and kind of fertilizing ground for rumors and regional rivalries. On the regional level, Saudi outlets have been pretty vocal. This is not new. I mean, obviously, Iranian and Saudi media always go after one another. But the interesting part was that the Israeli media were also pretty active in terms of speculating as what happened and who might be responsible, especially that there's one of the strongest possibilities, may be the Israeli involvement. But on the trackers that I set up to kind of monitor the narratives going around, the Israeli media didn't really show up in terms of the frequency of their postings and how they were trying to play with narrative building. It was mostly Saudi media who tried to double down on what happened and why Iran is the most dangerous actor in the region. And this is exactly why the international community should do everything they can in order to prevent Iran from having nuclear capacity or even maybe a bomb.
Well, Samin, thanks very much. We'll turn to our first audience question, which arose during Farhad's opening remarks. This is a very interesting one. And essentially, how often do bad information actors in Iran, particularly Iranian authorities, believe some of the misinformation they help propagate? And an example here is, does Ayatollah Khamenei believe that COVID-19 specifically targets the Iranian genome?
Well, that's a very difficult question because I can't prove what he actually believes or not. But it seems that in these situations, and we've seen it happen over and over again, what my personal belief is that they need to come up with an excuse and an answer, come up with a response to the public that why they're in this mess that they are. So in case of Mr. Khamenei, this has been his typical go-to approach to blame it on the foreigners and enemies, as he calls them. So for this pandemic, in his mindset, probably, I mean, again, I can't say what he actually believes, but apparently in their mindset, there needs to be an explanation. It's not just we couldn't handle the situation well. There needs to be someone else to blame. And who else better than the US? And what more exciting than, oh, this is a warfare on Iran and it's targeted Iran. And when they said, then how come Italians are, Italy is dealing with this so much? One of these conspiracy theories is that, oh, that's because the genome of Iranians and Italians are very similar. So, so they make up as they go along. And it's just kind of a way to save face in these situations.
All right. We had another question arise during Michael's comments, and we'll combine two things here. First, Michael, could you tell us a bit more about the demographics of who in Iran listens to VOA and who might be providing some material for you? And then also, in your experience, does user-generated content you receive generally hold up to scrutiny, or are there many attempts to mislead?
Those are two good questions. In terms of the demographics of who our audience members are in Iran, my understanding is that it's hard to do audience research in Iran because VOA in the past has used organizations like Gallup to find out what kinds of people listen to, watch, read VOA content around the world, but I don't think that they can, organizations like that can operate inside Iran given the hostility between Iran and the US. So getting data is hard on the demographics, but I just know anecdotally that we do have large social media audiences on our VOA Persian Instagram account, for example. I believe we have over 1 million people who follow us on Instagram. We have a lot of followers on our Facebook and Twitter accounts too. So we can get a sense, I guess, from people who follow our accounts, post messages, send us messages of the types of people out there. We also have Iranians from around the country calling in to a program that we have called Straight Talk or Riyakhat. That show, unfortunately, has been preempted by the pandemic. We haven't been able to run it as we usually do. So we just get a sense from the people who reach out to us, and they do come from all over the country, men, women of various ages. And your second question, if you can just remind me?
Sure. A bit more about the credibility, as you found it, of the user-generated content you receive.
So I guess I try to be personally a little skeptical about any photograph or video clip that we get. I work with my colleagues in this vetting team to try to figure out, is this something original? I always ask the questions, can we determine when this particular video clip was filmed, where it was filmed, that it basically claims to be what it says it is. And I haven't personally seen in these last few months any deliberate attempts to, let's say, trick us by sending video clips through our Telegram channel, for example, that are fake. I haven't come across those kinds of clips myself, but sometimes we'll receive a video clip, let's say, that has also been shared on Twitter. So it could just be that the clip that was sent to us by an Iranian social media user is something that user found somewhere else and sent to us. So we also have to try to determine, is this content that we're getting original and unique coming from this particular person who sent it to us, or has it already been spread around by other people? So those are all the kinds of questions and issues that we face as we try to vet our content.
Mm-hmm. And this raises a related question. Would welcome thoughts from Polly or Samin. There are a number of avenues of Iranian influence and disinformation operations. Is it a common tactic to try to share doctored information with international journalists in an attempt to get it amplified?
I mean, it's been historically one of the tricks out of the playbook of disinformation and influence operations, even from before the internet age, to kind of see false stories in especially the free press in the West. But I think the internet is definitely facilitating that. I've heard from my journalist friends that they have, for example, Twitter alerts for specific words in Persian and other languages set up in order to kind of understand if A, something happens, and B, who may be trying to seed specific stories. And in the past few weeks, the word explosion in Persian and fajar has been one of the most used keywords that a lot of people, not only pro-regime, but also like other accounts that may be biased against the Islamic Republic have been using in order to create this hype that everywhere in Iran is on fire or everyone is exploding, just to keep this ball of Iran is on fire or everything is bad rolling, and not necessarily with correct information. And so I think that creates a pretty foggy environment for a lot of journalists and Iran observers out there to distinguish what's accurate and what's not. And the task is getting more and more complicated, for sure.
So we have a very general, rather epistemological question. Basically, how do people in Iran know what's true and what's not? It seems like directed at Farhad, but would welcome thoughts from anyone. If you are an average consumer of information in Iran, which is a very digitally connected society, how much trust can you place in the sources of information that are available to you? Or do you know to be skeptical?
Well, in my own experience as in working monitoring misinformation, dealing with users, is that there's not much trust in the official media, and this when something important happens, however the domestic media writes about it or have a point of view about it, or it's not accepted by the people, and it's sometimes even goes the other way around. For example, the recent debate about Iran's agreement with the 25-year agreement with China, that the more the media and the officials are denying it, the more the people are becoming sure that there is something. So, and this is in cases like the pandemic, this was not good. And this lack of trust obviously led people to trust more social media and closed Telegram groups to find an alternative to what they can trust. So they lean on each other, which, it's the perfect place for misinformation and false, content. But I mean, that's a very challenging thing for us as fact checkers, to help people, to understand what they can trust and what they can't.
To add to what Farhad was saying, I think there's also a level where, aside from not paying much attention to domestic media, they are looking at satellite television. They're listening to Manato Farsi, BBC Farsi, Iran International, VOA, and all these other satellite channels, and looking for the information from there. But again, it's that instant gratification that kind of pushes them back to looking at their cell phones or their laptops or computers, where they feel the need to get on Telegram or Twitter just to get a sense of what's going on. So I think it's that quick access to information that's kind of pushing them in the direction to go more online than going actually to satellite television these days, or they have to wait for sometimes on the hour news coverage versus breaking news because there's other programs that are being aired on these channels.
Well, I can also add something, an example of the skepticism that Iranian people have toward official information about the pandemic. So there were, early on in Iran's official outbreak, several Iranian lawmakers and I believe other officials who were posting on social media that they had contracted the coronavirus. Posting video clips of themselves saying, I have the virus, for example, a lawmaker named Mahmoud Sadeghi, as well as several others. So we had a call-in show on Straight Talk to get people's views about these admissions. And we had several callers tell us that they were very skeptical about these assertions that officials had the virus. Some people felt that the officials, the lawmakers, were telegraphing that they had the virus just to try to show that they were just average people and that they were experiencing the same problems as everybody else. Other callers to the show were actually angry and said, these officials, these lawmakers get tested so quickly and to go public with their positive diagnoses. They have access to that testing and we don't. Early on in Iran's outbreak, the access to testing was rather limited and average people could not get tested and certainly could not get test results as quickly as some of these officials apparently did.
So Holly mentioned at the end of her presentation about the George Floyd protests and opportunistic use by Iranian media. But an audience member is hoping, Holly, that you could talk a bit more about that. And more broadly to the panel, is there an indication that the US is using these messaging or disinformation, that the US, that Iran is currently using more, using messaging around the George Floyd protests and some of its more clandestine influence operations? And this also reaches into a broader question of your assessment of Iranian efforts going into the 2020 elections, and particularly the Iranian perspective on renewed hopes for changes to the JCPOA under a new US administration. So those are two big questions related to Iran and the United States. We'll start with Holly, and then for anyone else who wants to take a crack at it.
Well, I think what really was interesting was, like I mentioned earlier, was when President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was trying to show himself as woke Ahmadinejad. And he's been doing this for a while, where he tweets out rap lyrics. And I think that's an attestment to the genius of his Twitter team, where they're trying to be relatable. And so they were trying to show that, hey, we're relevant. We actually are paying attention to what's happening. And I think that some media outlets kind of paid attention to it, especially since he used an explicit term, which I obviously will not mention. So that was one example of how some focus was put on that, and there was a lot of interactions online with him in the past where he interacts with young, I would say Gen Z and maybe some even millennials, and messaging on Iran, and essentially that Iran is the voice of the oppressed peoples, whether they be in the Middle East or in the United States, with these protests. So, and you see these Iranian officials trying to put out this narrative that they are pushing against imperialist America and its oppressive ways. And that was exemplified with these Black Lives Matter protests. But on the bigger front, whether that was actually absorbed by the American people, I definitely would say no, but it was part of a bigger implication of pushing back against US policies by Russia and China. And I think that there was an overall wave of these three countries kind of exploiting the unrest in the United States. And can you maybe repeat your earlier question about the JCPOA? I'm sorry.
Sure. And in your assessment, at this time, what would Iran like with regard to renewal of the JCPOA? And what prospects are seen in Tehran that might occur under a new US administration?
Mm. Well, right now, we're in a big conundrum right now, given that come October, the UN arms embargo on Iran expires, and the Trump administration has suddenly decided that they're now a part of the JCPOA, even though the remaining signatories are saying that they can't join back in once they've left. So there's this argument going on. So it really depends on what happens come October, because the United States has threatened to snap back UN sanctions on Iran. And if that's what happens, Iran's given 5 options that they will run with. One of them is that they will withdraw from the Iran nuclear agreement. The other is they will withdraw from the NPT treaty. And some other lesser, I would say problematic ones, but still problematic, would be this continued acceleration of their nuclear program and breaches of the JCPOA. So it really depends on what happens come October, how they'll react. And I think the calculation is that everything ends in October. And I don't think that, given that the fact that there are hardliners in parliament, we expect that the next Iranian president will likely be a hardliner, that this rapprochement with the United States will not be happening anytime soon. If anything, they will be taking a harder approach towards the United States in the near future, unfortunately.
And we'll close with a lightning round to all 4 of our participants. And we have 4 questions. And this is also your closing remarks, so just a minute each if you can. First to Farhad, surrounding the biological weapon theory regarding COVID-19, how much of it do you think is misinformation versus purposefully disseminated disinformation? To Michael, if you could talk briefly about whether you need to encrypt data in order to take it safely out of Iran to international journalists. To Samin, if you could talk a bit about the character of Iranian disinformation operations we might see going into 2020 and how their tactics have changed. And then finally, to Holly, regarding the Natanz bombing, do we know if there's been much explicit blame placed on the United States? And this will be the conclusion of our seminar. So with that, we will start with Farhad.
So I think it's a mix of both. In the start, it was definitely misinformation that was not unique to Iran. It was we were witnessing it around the world. Speculation about this being not a natural or a normal virus, but a warfare. But I think in case of Iran, it soon became a tool to distract from other issues that the government was dealing. So they started using that as a talking point. And so for a while, they were just pushing this idea into media, and that's where it became disinformation too. So that would be a short answer.
Gotcha. Thank you, Farhad. And now to Michael on encryption.
Thank you. So in terms of using encryption to get information out of Iran, what I can say is that much of the information we've received comes through our social media channels, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Telegram. I believe that there are various degrees of encryption that are part of those social media platforms. So members of our Iranian audience do feel comfortable in many cases using such platforms to send us, text messages, photographs, video clips. Also, we sometimes just pick up the phone and call people who are inside Iran who are willing to talk to us that way. And of course, WhatsApp is another platform that we can use to communicate with people. So I do think encryption is a part of those various platforms that we use to communicate with people. And I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Michael. And to Samin on the evolution of Iranian disinformation methods.
I think going into the 2020 election, Iran has a lot of stakes to play and try to protect. And so I would not be surprised if they try to double down on their efforts, because they have both the capability and willingness and the ambition to mess around with the US politics and election as much as possible. I think what they are more likely to do is to double down on their efforts to target progressives and leftist activists in the United States through both social media campaigns as well as the fake websites that they put out, and they attract a lot of anti-imperialist activists and writers from around the world, and specifically in the United States, in order to go after the hawkish policies of the United States that affect Iran and other repressed actors around the world. But I think an equally important question is what the impact of these operations is, and to not overestimate the success of these campaigns. I think so far what we're seeing is that the reach of their operations is diminishing, partially thanks to the repeated takedowns of Twitter and Facebook. Because, you know, when we overestimate the impact that these operations might make, we're basically giving them a free pass to boast themselves and basically think more creatively about how to get more success.
Thank you, Samin. And Holly, I'll give you the last word on blame for the U.S. for the Natanz bombing. And if you will, one last question we got, which I found very apropos. Do Iranian authorities, or the average Iranian, do they have much exposure to events like this one? Like what is our potential audience beyond folks who are necessarily listening right now?
Well, that's a great question. Maybe I'll address that first and I'll go to Natanz. You would be surprised who watches our stuff. Actually, it was Norman Rule who previously handled the CIA case file that I remember saying at a think tank event in Tel Aviv once, that he addressed the Iranian regime that was watching the live video stream because he claimed that they are watching us. And I think that there is some truth to that there are some people watching these events and they're trying to understand the way we think about Iran. And I think there's also some public interest online with Iranians that are English speakers and those that are interested in world affairs. And some of those are Twitter followers of my own or some of the other people that are in this event, but it's not something that's wide and overreaching. But going back to Natanz, there's certainly always a US blame when it comes to these unusual events in Iran, especially when you look at the context of the Stuxnet virus in 2010. But in this context, we're seeing the fingers mostly being pointed at Israel. And despite this, as Simin said earlier, there is caution being used with these accusations, because that would possibly mean that the Iranian government would have to respond to these attacks on their country and on their sovereignty, arguably. So I think that's why you're just not going to be hearing that kind of reaction from Iran, at least for the time being, and in a very open way, at least. Maybe in the future in cyber attacks or something. I can't really speculate.
Well, Holly, thank you very much. And with that, if our audience wants further reading, they won't want for sources from our guests today, I would say to check out Bakname, to investigate the Voice of America's coverage on these critical issues, and to look to the output of the Digital Forensic Research Lab and the Middle East program here at the Atlantic Council, as well as Iran Source blog and the Iranist. And with that, we're adjourned. Thank you very much for attending today. Take care.